I want to start with a question that sounds simple, but almost nobody wants to answer honestly. A great power spends 4 months bombing a country. It kills that country's supreme leader on the first morning of the war. And then it spends the rest of the year quietly agreeing to almost every condition that country sets for a ceasefire. So who actually won? The official answer is easy to find. A dangerous regime was dealt a historic blow. America and Israel demonstrated overwhelming power. The world is safer for it. That is the story repeated on cable news tonight. I want to walk through a different way of reading the same facts using the tools historians and strategists actually use when a story doesn't add up. Because when you strip away the press conferences and look at the sequence of events since late February, something much stranger emerges. Not a clean victory, not even really a defeat in the conventional sense. Something closer to a trap that closed exactly the way traps are supposed to close, except on the people who thought they had built it. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how a war that opened with a promise of total victory ended 4 months later with a signed document that looks remarkably like the deal that could have been reached without a single bomb falling. Let's lay out the timeline first because the timeline is the evidence. On February 28, 2026, American and Israeli aircraft struck Iran in a coordinated operation codenamed Operation Epic Fury by Washington and Operation Roaring Lion by Israel. This was not a limited one-night affair like the strikes of the previous summer. This was the opening of a full war. Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei was killed on day one, along with a number of senior commanders and officials. Iran's response was immediate. Within days, missiles and drones were fired at American bases at Gulf states, hosting American forces and traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow channel through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil physically has to pass, collapsed by more than 90% almost overnight. Fuel shortages appeared in South and East Asia within weeks. This was not a symbolic gesture. This was a country demonstrating that it could reach into the global economy and squeeze it. In March, President Trump's language hardened into total absolutism. No deal, only unconditional surrender. But on the ground, the picture told a more complicated story. The strait remained disrupted despite claims that it had reopened. Iran's missile capability, which had been declared destroyed, kept firing. By early April, a ceasefire was announced brokered by Pakistan. It did not hold cleanly. Within hours, an Israeli operation into Lebanon nearly collapsed the entire framework because nobody had firmly agreed whether Lebanon was included at all. Through May, negotiators inched towards something bigger. By mid-June, the United States and Iran signed a formal memorandum of understanding at the Palace of Versailles, a real signed document extending the ceasefire and laying out a roadmap on the hardest issues left. The future of Hormuz, Iran's frozen financial assets, sanctions relief, and what remained of the nuclear file. Sit with that shape for a second. A war that began with the assassination of a head of state and a promise of regime change ended 4 months later with the aggressor signing a document that reads less like a surrender for the other side and more like a negotiated settlement between equals. Nobody talks about regime change anymore. The conversation has narrowed down to shipping lanes, frozen bank accounts, and inspection rights, almost exactly the menu of issues that sat on the table before a single bomb fell. To understand how that happened, we need history, because this exact shape has appeared before. There are 3 historical patterns worth understanding here, because once you see them, the rest of this story stops looking strange and starts looking familiar. The first is what historians sometimes call the entrapment dynamic. The cleanest case is the Bay of Pigs in 1961. A newly inaugurated American president inherited a plan to land Cuban exiles on the island and spark an uprising against Castro. Nearly every serious planner knew the operation had almost no chance of succeeding on its own terms. The most persuasive explanation historians have settled on is that the operation was never designed to win by itself. It was designed to be unabandonable, so that once exiles were pinned on a beach and dying, the president would feel forced to send in the Marines. It did not work. Kennedy let the operation fail rather than escalate. But the underlying pattern, designing a crisis so that walking away becomes more costly to a larger partner than escalating, is one of the oldest tricks in statecraft. The second pattern is economic, and it is older still. In 1973, an oil embargo by producing states reshaped American foreign policy more decisively than any tank division could have. The lesson from that year is simple. The side less able to absorb economic pain tends to negotiate first, regardless of who is winning on the ground. The third pattern concerns alliances and reputation. In 1956, Britain, France, and Israel jointly invaded Egypt after it nationalized the Suez Canal. Militarily, the operation went fine for the invaders. Politically, it was a catastrophe because Washington refused to back the operation and forced a humiliating British withdrawal through financial pressure. The lasting damage was not military. It was that every government in the Middle East learned in real time that British guarantees of protection were no longer worth very much. London's status as regional guarantor never fully recovered. Keep these three patterns in mind because the war we just walked through carries traces of all three at once. Start with entrapment. In February, a smaller regional power had wanted a decisive American confrontation with its chief rival for the better part of 2 decades. The larger power, the United States, had intelligence and military leadership that by multiple credible accounts actually opposed the operation before it began for a reason any historian could have told them. Air power alone does not topple a regime. It never has, not in Serbia in the 90s, not in Iraq in 1991. You cannot bomb a government out of existence from 30,000 feet unless you are also willing to put soldiers on the ground, and putting soldiers on the ground was never something Washington wanted here because everyone remembered exactly how the last 2 ground wars in that region ended. So the honest question is not whether this was a good decision. It is whose decision it really was, and who benefited most once backing out looked like weakness. This is not a smoking gun. It is speculation, and it deserves to be flagged honestly as speculation. But the shape of the sequence, a committed regional partner pushing for shock and awe, a more reluctant larger power initially resisting, and a decapitation strike that made de-escalation politically humiliating rhymes with the entrapment pattern closely enough that it deserves to be named. Now, the economic pattern. 90% of shipping traffic through Hormuz evaporated within days of the war's start. That is not collateral damage. That is leverage deployed with precision. On the other side, President Trump himself in public remarks invoked the 20th century president most remembered for presiding over the Great Depression as the thing he did not want history to say about him. When the person setting war policy says on the record that he does not want to be remembered as the man who caused an economic catastrophe, that is someone who has already priced in the cost of continuing and is looking for the exit. Wars are won or lost as much on balance sheets as on battlefields, and the side more exposed to fuel prices and jittery markets usually blinks first, regardless of who appears to be winning. Now, the alliance pattern. Consider the Gulf states that spent the last 20 years betting their security on an American umbrella. Their territory was hit by Iranian missiles and drones. Their shipping was squeezed. And what did they get for it? A superpower that spent 4 months unable to close out a war, it started now negotiating over Hormuz tolls and frozen assets with the same government it tried to overthrow. If you are a planner in Riyadh or Doha right now, you are running exactly the calculation Arab and European governments ran after 1956, quietly asking whether the guarantee you have been paying for in access and loyalty will actually be there next time you need it. There is a fourth thread tying all of this together, and it explains why the public conversation about this war sounds so disconnected from the document actually being negotiated. Call it the narrative gap, the space between what a war actually accomplished and what the people who started it are willing to say out loud. The Soviets did not announce in 1988 that Afghanistan had failed. They announced a policy of national reconciliation. Washington did not describe the final years in Vietnam as unwinnable. It introduced a program called Vietnamization. In both cases, the language and the reality on the ground drifted further apart the longer the war dragged on. Watch for that same drift here. In February, the promise was regime change. By April, it had narrowed to a ceasefire and a rough framework. By June, it had narrowed further to a memorandum focused on shipping rights, frozen assets, and inspection access, the exact menu of technical issues that ordinary diplomacy handles all the time, war or no war. Nobody canceled the war and announced it ended on humbling terms. The goalposts simply moved quietly enough that by the time you notice how far they have traveled, the people who moved them have already started talking about the next round of negotiations as if the original promise never existed. Put these patterns together and the outcome stops looking like a paradox. It starts looking like the predictable result of a smaller, more committed actor, pulling a larger, more economically fragile, more reputationally exposed actor into a fight neither its own advisors nor its own economy wanted. For the United States, the cost is a demonstrated limit on what decapitation strikes and superior firepower can actually achieve against a state willing to absorb enormous damage and hold a global choke point hostage in return. That lesson will not be lost on other regional actors watching closely, including whoever eventually has to plan the next confrontation with Tehran. For Israel, the strike that killed Khamenei was in narrow military terms a stunning tactical success. But tactical success and strategic outcome are not the same thing, and a war that concludes with sanctions relief on the table and American forces negotiating troop withdrawals looks increasingly disconnected from that opening moment. For the Gulf Arab states, the lesson is the most uncomfortable of all. They absorbed real strikes on their own territory in support of an operation they did not start, and the security guarantee underneath their entire strategic posture just proved less solid than assumed. That is arguably the most underappreciated casualty of this entire episode. Not a battlefield, a reputation. And reputations once cracked are almost impossible to fully repair. Ask the British. And globally, the Hormuz crisis exposed something markets have known abstractly for decades but rarely felt this acutely. A single choke point controlled by a country willing to accept enormous costs can disrupt the global economy faster than sanctions or naval deployments can restore it. That leverage does not disappear once this ceasefire holds. It sits there permanently ready to be used again. The winners and losers here are not clean-cut. Iran absorbed devastating losses, thousands, dead infrastructure, destroyed its supreme leader, killed, and still emerged with enough leverage to shape the terms of its own ceasefire. The United States achieved its immediate tactical objective in February and still found itself negotiating rather than dictating by June. That asymmetry between military outcome and political result is the real story more than any single claim of victory or defeat. I want to be careful here because the single biggest mistake in watching a war like this is confusing who declares victory the loudest with who actually got what they wanted. Every leader involved is going to describe the outcome as vindication. That is simply how domestic politics works in every country under every flag. 3 trajectories are worth watching from here. The first is that the framework signed at Versailles holds in negotiations over sanctions and troop withdrawal produce a durable settlement, an outcome that requires both governments to accept terms that look to their own publics like concessions rather than triumphs. The second is that the ceasefire holds militarily while the underlying negotiation stalls, producing something closer to a frozen conflict punctuated by incidents like the drone strike on the cargo vessel, ever lovely in late June with tensions simmering but no full return to war. The third and most dangerous is that an incident around Hormuz, a mined tanker, a naval confrontation escalates beyond what either side intends and drags the region back into open war before a final settlement is reached. There is also a competing explanation worth giving equal airtime, because intellectual honesty matters more than a tidy narrative. It is entirely possible. This was never a trap at all, simply a miscalculation, a belief that overwhelming force would produce quick capitulation, followed by the difficult work of managing the fallout once that assumption proved wrong. Entrapment and miscalculation produce very similar aftermaths. The difference matters if you are assigning blame. It matters less if you are trying to predict what happens next, because both explanations point toward the same conclusion. The appetite in Washington for a second round of this war is very low. And for now, the leverage sits with the side that can still close a shipping lane. Watch 3 things going forward, not the ones that make the best headlines. Watch the price of oil and the state of the shipping lanes, because that tells you who is under more economic pressure to fold. Watch what the Gulf states do with their own diplomacy over the coming year, because that tells you what the alliance actually cost. And watch whether the language coming out of Washington keeps shrinking from regime change to negotiated settlement to simple stability, because the vocabulary a government uses to describe a war usually shrinks in exact proportion to how much it has actually had to give up to end it. So return to the question this documentary opened with. How does a country whose supreme leader was assassinated in the first strike of a war end up months later being negotiated with rather than dictated to? The answer is not that Iran won a conventional military victory. It did not. Its infrastructure was devastated, its leadership decapitated, thousands of its people killed. But military devastation and strategic defeat are not automatically the same thing, and a willingness to absorb catastrophic costs combined with control over a choke point the global economy cannot function without gave Iran leverage that outlasted the war's opening weeks. Whether history ultimately records this as an Iranian victory, a mutual exhaustion, or simply an unfinished war paused by a fragile memorandum depends entirely on what happens in the negotiating room over the coming weeks, a room where for now, Iran is still sitting across the table from the government that once said there would be no deal at all. The war that was supposed to end with surrender ended instead with a signature. And the question still hanging over this conflict is not who struck harder in February. It is who is actually setting the terms in the months since.